In honor of Memorial Day, this year we've put together a very special program encompassing the history of the American cemetery at Margraten in the Netherlands. We hope as you learn about how the Dutch remember our heroes that you will also take the time to remember and honor them as well.
My father
My father,
was killed February 3rd, 1945.
November 3rd, 1945.
April 14th of 1945.
I never knew my father. He went overseas when I was 10 weeks old. He was killed when I was 11 months old. I have no independent memories of him other than what people have told me.
I know no other life. You never really believed that he was dead. But war always leaves behind dead soldiers, grieving widows, grieving parents, and children who have suffered a loss that they have no control over.
We all are orphans, but we all have our own stories because we all have different circumstances. But we'll always have a special place in our heart for each other because we've walked down that road.
My name is Arthur Schoten.
Billy Ann Myers Meeks.
Geraldine Conway Marensky.
My father, Staff Sergeant Max Schoten,
Corporal William H. Myers Jr.
David Conway.
is buried at the Netherlands American Military Cemetery.
Netherlands American Cemetery.
The Netherlands American Cemetery and Memorial at Margraten. On May 1st, 1945, my mother received a telegram in the mail from the Department of the Army telling her that her husband and my father had been killed in action April 14th, 1945 in Germany. And our lives changed, obviously, from that moment. During the next 4 years, my mother received information from the United States government which asked her many questions about the disposal of his remains, whether or not she wanted him brought back home or not. She made the decision at the time not to return his body to the United States, but to leave him in Europe where he died with his buddies. And over the course of time, she was informed that he had been interred at the American Netherlands Cemetery and Memorial at Margraten, Holland. The footage that you are viewing now is of the first Memorial Day ceremony at Margraten in 1945. For those people who have not been to Holland, Margraten is a very small village on the border of Belgium and Germany and Holland, and it's about 6 miles from the center of the larger city, Maastricht, which a number of people may know having watched Andre Rieu on PBS. He does concerts from that city because he lives in that city and was born in that city. I grew up, actually went to college under the GI Bill because my father was killed in action. That's a piece of information that not too many children knew about because it was learned accidentally through veterans' notices in newspapers. The government didn't officially tell you that you were part of the GI program. Anyway, my mother found out about it, and I actually went through Simmons College in Boston as a GI, which was kind of cool, in a women's college. The government had declared me a war orphan because of a line in the Gettysburg Address where Abraham Lincoln referred to the widows and orphans. So governments being governments, they like to put you in categories, and that's what we were. From what I've been able to gather over the last umpteen years, they have documented evidence that there's about 183,000 children from World War II who lost their fathers. The numbers aren't accurate. We think there's a lot more. Anyway, grew up, married, had children, always wanted to go to see my father's grave, but of course it was very expensive, and you had a family and your money went elsewhere. In 1983, I got a job at Digital Equipment Corporation, and my first boss was a man who had just transferred to the United States from Nijmegen in Holland. And we worked very closely together for a couple of months, and one day we were having coffee, and I asked him about where he was from in Holland, and he told me the name of a town. And for the first time in my life, I mentioned the name Margraten. I never talked about it. And I asked him if he knew where that was, and he pulled back and said, "I do. Why do you know about it?" And I told him, I said, my dad is buried there. And he stood up and said, "Well, have you been there?" And I said, "No, well, you must go." And he started nagging me and my husband every month, "When are you leaving?" So my late husband and I went over in 1985, in early May, and my boss had his sister and brother-in-law meet us. They lived in Maastricht. They're very nice Dutch people with 3 little boys, and we just hit it off immediately. So John and I went to the cemetery for the first time, and it was a dreadful day. It was raining. It couldn't have been worse. The weather was awful. And all I remember saying is to my father was, "Couldn't you have done something about the weather?" But it was a very interesting experience. People always have asked me what it was like for me to go there, and because they said, well, it must have been closure. And it's not closure. Closure to me is the sound of a door slamming. For me, it was a place. I could touch the stone. I could see his name. And it was an aperture, an opening, a new pathway for me to take. I wasn't the war orphan anymore. I had a place where my father was. But what mainly struck me as the morning went on that morning was that I was approached by Dutch people that day who were at the cemetery, and they all asked the same thing: "Why are you here?" And I told them, and they all would turn and just put their arms around me and say thank you. And that did it. I lost it. I had never had that in my country. Nobody said thank you to us children. We were just expected to keep quiet and march in parades and carry a flag, and you know, people would whisper, "My father died," as if it was our fault. Well, anyway, it started something. My husband and I went back a number of times. The Dutch people we met, my boss's sister Annika and her husband Leon, became very close friends and actually adopted my father's grave. They explained to me on our first trip that in Holland, the Dutch adopt these graves at the cemetery, and it was something I had never heard of before. And to them, it was very practical. We do this, and we will do this for you. And we were like, well, fine. So over time, more time passed. We went back and forth a couple of times. They came here. We went there. My husband passed in 1993, and one of my first trips after he passed was back to Holland. And in 1995, I brought both of my children with me so that they could stand at their grandfather's grave for the first time. And then I found out about this organization in the United States that had started up for war orphans of World War II. And I did some research and went to a conference and realized that I wasn't the only kid. And I ended up joining them. It's the American World War II Orphans Network. It was founded in 1991 by a lady whose father is buried in Italy, who said, there has to be more than me. And we have a membership now of anywhere between 500 and 1,000 people, depending upon what's going on in the world sometimes, and the ages of people. Well, on one of my trips to a War Orphans Network conference, I started asking questions because I do things like that. And I said, well, have you ever visited your father's grave? No. Well, why don't you? Well, So I thought, well, there must be a way to do this. So with the help of another war orphan who was a travel agent, I put together the first trip from our organization to an American cemetery abroad, and that was in 2005. We made it a short trip, 5 days, never again. Stayed in Maastricht, and from there it's just blossomed. I had people contact me that heard we were coming. One group asked if they could help escort us to the cemetery for the first time, and this woman arrived with World War II vehicles and jeeps and half tracks, and everybody piled on, and we rode the 6 miles in style. One of my main reasons for organizing this first trip for American war orphans to a cemetery overseas was because I thought the value of traveling together would have a more positive effect on everyone. The touch of an other war orphan's hand on a shoulder in understanding said more than words could say when we talk to each other. I've met an awful lot of war orphans from not only Margraten, but many of the other cemeteries around the world. The American Battles Monument Commission maintains all of the World War I and World War II cemeteries around the world. There are no cemeteries for any wars after that around the world because of the invention of the jet engine. After World War II, and in Korea, bodies were able to be transported more quickly back to the States, whereas in World War II, it took anywhere from 9 months to 5 years to get a body back. The cemetery is very beautiful, as most of these military cemeteries are overseas. I've been to 3 of them in Europe. They're all a little different, but they're all with white Carrara marble, and their Stars of David and the white crosses are exactly the same height. They're spaced accordingly. They're just beautiful. And they are all maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. However, Margraten is unique because of the adoption program that was initiated in the winter of 1945 when the cemetery was being built. Because of the battles of the Hurtgen Forest and the battles of the Bulge, the 2 cemeteries in Belgium at Henri-Chapelle and at the Ardennes were filled to capacity. Thus the necessity for another cemetery, and that cemetery was built in Margraten. And so they sent out Colonel Showman from the United States Army to go find land to bury the dead. And he found farmland in Holland and negotiated with the farmers, who gave up a lot of their land so that they could have a cemetery there. During that time, people in the United States were learning that their loved one had been buried at Margraten. And people would write to the mayor and say, could you put a flower? Could you do this? Could you take a picture? And this is a very small town, I mean, very small town at that time. And the mayor got this town council together and others, and they began this program of adopting graves. The adoption program began in January of 1945 and it has grown over the years. Adopters of graves are required to pay a small fee to become an adopter, and then are required to visit the cemetery at least 4 times a year and bring flowers to their soldier's grave. In preparation for the Margraten Kids of the American World War II Orphans Network trip in 2005, I called the president of the adoption committee, Mrs. Opre, to let her know that we were coming for the Memorial Day services at the cemetery. Mrs. Opre went to the mayor of the town of Margraten and planned a reception for all of the travelers and all of the adopters of those orphans who were traveling so that we could all meet. And on a Saturday afternoon, we met at the town hall where there was a reception in our honor, and all of the orphans got to meet the adopters of their father's graves. Many of them who were the adopters were now into the second or third generation of their family in adopting these graves. So it was quite a wonderful experience for all involved. The aftermath of these meetings is that many of these families are now part of each other's families. They've visited back and forth to the United States and back to Holland. They exchanged Christmas gifts and letters, photographs. So the men that died and are buried at Margraten, actually, the aftermath of those deaths is the fact that we have now got a generation of people who have become acquainted and become part of each other's families. That would never have happened had these men not died in battle. Another outcome of the trip in 2005 was that one of the travelers was the grandson of a man buried at Margraten. Mark LaPointe was born and raised in Amesbury, Mass. His mother and father were on the trip, and Mark came along as a surprise. He's always been rather fascinated with his grandfather's history. And he was so moved by his trip to Margraten that when he came home, he wrote a song about it. Mark is a songwriter and a performer, and we're going to play his song for you right now. The name of the song is Somewhere in Germany. He based it on letters that were sent home by his grandfather to his grandmother. And most letters started with the words, "I'm writing to you from somewhere in Belgium, France, Germany." And Mark based his story and his song on those letters. When the adoption committee learned that Mark LaPointe would be accompanying us in 2015, they invited him to perform his beautiful song as part of a ceremony that they held for our fathers and for us in the town of Mesh. There was a procession and a beautiful ceremony in the center of town, at which time Mark performed his song. What you will see now is a video montage of the photos from that procession, as well as you will be able to listen to Mark's song in the background.
Letter read today, like so many before it came. They all start the same. Don't worry, I'm doing okay. Writing with love, you see, from somewhere in Germany. Days sure seem long, still we move on and on. For once this is through, your darling Bill can come back to you. Until then I dream of thee from this foxhole in Germany. Distance I hear the bells of Christmas ringing, and I wonder if you know how much your love has kept me going when all my strength is gone. And how's my little girl? Does she ask for me? Please tell her that I miss her so, just as much as she does me. I send her hugs and kisses sweet from somewhere in Germany.
none like this before it came. Its words struck like a blind in pain, for the ultimate in price was paid.
Laid down his life, you see, on the 23rd of February. Now he's resting there in peace, somewhere near Germany.
After leading 2 trips to Margraten, both in 2005 and in 2010, I thought I was finished. But then I received a call from Mrs. Opre inviting the AWON Margraten kids back to Margraten to help celebrate the 70th year of Memorial Day at the cemetery, as well as the 70th year of the adoption program. Mrs. Opre informed me that as part of having us visit Margraten for Memorial Day of 2015, the adoption committee planned on paying for the use of a bus for 5 days, a formal dinner, a luncheon, a meeting at the town hall with adopters, and a wonderful concert. I was overwhelmed, as were most of the people who I contacted about this trip. We ended up with about 55 people coming from all parts of the United States. So during the year of planning the trip and getting people on board who were coming, I and another person in our organization worked on an idea we had had for many years that had never been able to be fulfilled. We wanted to leave something behind of permanence to honor the adoption program that had been there for 70 years. And what we came up with the idea was to have a special bench sculpted and dedicated during that Memorial Day weekend. The mayor of the town of Margraten granted us permission to install the bench on the town hall plaza in front of the town hall, and it was unveiled during the adopters' reception at the town hall. We planned on keeping this a secret, which if any of you who live in a small town like Merrimac understand, keeping a secret in a small town is very difficult. But we managed to pull it off. Not one member of the adoption committee knew what that thing was on the town hall plaza that was wrapped in plastic. And during the afternoon of our reception, I invited everyone outside and we unveiled it. And it is in a permanent place at the town hall, and it is in honor of the adoption program as well as all of the Dutch adopters who have participated over the past 70 years. I need to take a moment here to thank a number of people who contributed to the cost involved in having this bench sculpted and placed at the town hall. All of the participants in the trip contributed as much as they could afford. We received a very large grant from Boston Scientific when they heard about this project. I also received a donation, a nice donation from the American Legion in Merrimac and from the Senior Center. So there were just more than World War II orphans involved. There were other people who cared and understood the significance of placing this bench in that particular spot. One of the things that happened in 1995 when I was visiting Holland with my children, we had stayed with my adopters, Annika and Leon Segers, and all of us went to the cemetery. At that time, my daughter had become very fluent in Dutch for her job, and it was very surreal to stand at my father's grave, her grandfather's grave, and have her talking to the adopters of his grave in Dutch. Yeah. It was unbelievable. And it was a serious conversation. So later in the day, because I'm a mother and I'm curious, I said to her, "What was that all about?" And she said, "Well, Mom," she said, "Leon is a very sensitive man, and he wanted to know what it was like for me and my brother to be at a grandfather's grave, a man who we never met." And I thought, my God, you know, it's always been about my loss. But it's more than my loss, it's a generational loss. And I said to her, "Oh my God, what was it like?" And she said, "Well, it isn't sad." She said, "I looked around and I realized that my grandfather's death wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. If he hadn't died," she said, "your life would have been totally different. We would never, ever have been here. There would have been no reason. We would never have gotten to know these lovely people that we know, that are now part of our family." And she said, "So for me, my grandfather's death was a new path to love and the ability to love people from another country and to know what their life is like." And I couldn't say it any better than she did. We're fortunate enough with technology these days that we have this wonderful capability through Skype. And as we were getting ready to do this program, Chris set up a Skype interview with my adopters, so you'll be able to see who they are and hear what they have to say about what adoption means to them.
We have a very special guest with us today, Leon Sagers. He's the adopter of Corporal Conway's grave in Margraten, Netherlands. And thank you for joining us, Leon.
Okay.
When did you adopt Corporal Conway's grave? Exactly.
I think it was anywhere in the 80s. I think 83 or so, or 82, as Jerry visited us for the first time. She with her husband and a friend with her husband also, with his husband also. And since that time, we took care for the grave of her father. And yeah, that means that we visited several times a year. Let's say the 1st of November, and let's say Memorial Day, so and some other times. So it is several times a year, and we put flowers then on the grave, and have a minute, thinking a minute for what the liberators, the American liberators, have done to us in the 40s, of course. And all the graves are adopted, and also all the names on the walls from the missing are also adopted. And there is a waiting list I read in the papers of the foundation. Mm. So there is a lot of attention for the cemetery, for the American cemetery in Margraten, in our region.
What does the grave adoption process mean to you? Maybe talk a little about its history, how you got involved through Jerry, or did
Yes, we got involved by Jerry, but since we met Jerry, the whole organization and also the foundation here in the Netherlands has got a lot more attention, and it's more active now as it was at that time. And it's because I think it's because the following generation is moving on now and is coming on, and so in the 19th, and so there was a new president of the foundation, and she has managed it quite well. All the names and all the doctors, they make lists from it, and all they make a data file from all, and they keep it up to date. And also in the course of the year, there are some highlights in the attention that's on Memorial Day, and it's also in September a big event with singers and with music and with it's a kind of an opera, let's say.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a requiem in September. And that are the two major events in the year. So Memorial Day and the concert in November. Yeah, in September.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
And the cemetery is visited very well. As we are there, as we are visiting it, always people are on the cemetery. Always there are some people that are looking for a grave, looking for their grave, for the graves they have adopted. And also other visitors from all over the world are in Margraten. And it's also because of the activity of the foundation.
I see. Yeah. Well, we're grateful that it's in existence. I never knew anything about it until I met Jerry, and the fact that it's been going from the third generation of adopters, that's a really inspiring and amazing story. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Also, several books published on the item.
Yeah.
From in the English language, but also in Dutch, of course, and there's been a lot of research on the adoption phenomenon, let's say, and I think it's quite special.
Well, thanks again for sharing your insights with us, and appreciate you staying up late to make it convenient for my time. But thank you so much, and I look forward to sharing the whole show with you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
It was a pleasure. It was me a pleasure, Chris.
Always, yes. You as well.
Thank you.
The following montage is a collection of photographs taken during the Memorial Day ceremonies in 2015. The background music that you will hear is a very special song that was written on the 50th anniversary of Memorial Day at Margraten. It was written for the Dutch, and it asks the question of the Dutch, do you remember? The words are both in Dutch and are translated into English. The song is sung by a Dutch tenor, Hubert Dellemboy, who travels to Margraten every Memorial Day in order to sing this song.
Als men komt in de buurt van Margraten, daar ligt het grote Amerikaanse kerkhof. Daar liggen duizenden soldaten. Ze gingen er met eeuwig verlof. Het waren gewone mensen zoals wij, en toch grote helden door wat zij voor ons hebben gedaan. Nu liggen zij ver van huis, in onze velden. Denken wij daar nu nog eens aan?
Near Margraten, if you are ever there, you will find a large American cemetery. Thousands of soldiers lie there, on eternal leave. They were ordinary people, just like us. But we call them great heroes when we think of all they did for us. Now they rest, far from home, in our fields. Do we remember them?
Daar komen ze. Daar komen ze. Wij hier. Zij hebben voor ons gestreden. Wij werden door hen bevrijd. Wat hebben zij toen veel geleden, in die droevige, bange oorlogstijd. Zij hebben voor ons alles gegeven. En wat heeft hun dat toen opgebracht?
They fought for us. We were freed by them. How they suffered for us in those agonizing days of the war. They gave everything for us. And what did they get for it all?
Ja, denken wij daar nog eens aan?
Yes, we remember.
Max Cleland, the director of the American Battles Monument Commission in Washington, asked a member of AWON, Mr. Arthur Choten, to speak at the Memorial Day ceremonies in 2015. We're including Arthur's speech as an ending to this video montage for Memorial Day because what he has to say touched the hearts and the souls of everyone present. There were 10,000 people at the cemetery that day, and Arthur received the first ever standing ovation.
Major General Vanderlauw, Prime Minister Rutte, Commissioner Bovens, General Breedlove, Ambassador Brose, Congresswoman Morella, members of the American World War II Orphans Network, AWON, ladies and gentlemen, dames en heren. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy, in response to a question from a reporter about the inequities of military service, famously told Americans, "Life isn't fair." But my family, and the families of the 10,022 men and women buried or remembered here, already knew. For my mother, that harsh statement became personal on November 3rd, 1945, months after the war in Europe had ended, when my father, delivering the paperwork that would begin the process of sending men in his unit, including him, back home, was killed when the Jeep he was in collided with a truck. Life isn't fair. And as my 60 new brothers and sisters from AWON who are here today know all too well, the effects of that unfairness impacts those of us left behind for our entire lives. I never knew my father. He was sent overseas when I was 10 weeks old and killed a month before my first birthday. For my entire life, my mother couldn't talk about him without crying. I didn't want to make her cry. I didn't know him. I think of him almost every day, what he missed and what my mother and I missed. So here I am, 70 years old, more than twice the age of the father I never played catch with, never argued with, never even hugged. And the single thought in my mind today is that I hope he would be proud of me. Oh, the power these dead have over those they left behind. But for my family and the families of the other soldiers buried and remembered here, there was a comfort because we learned about the incredible efforts made by the people of the Netherlands to adopt these graves. First, the Burgercomité Margraten, and more recently, the Stichting Adoptiegraven, the Foundation for Adopting Graves. What would cause a nation recovering from losses and trauma of their own to adopt the sons and daughters of another nation? And what would keep that commitment alive for all of these years when the memory of that war has begun to fade? It speaks to the character of the people of the Netherlands that every single grave in this cemetery and virtually every single name on that wall has been adopted. It is a unique occurrence in the history of civilization, and it is deserving of recognition and of thanks. Yet I imagine that for many of the adopters, there is the question of why more families of these dead never visited the graves of their sons, their brothers, their husbands or fathers. Traveling to Europe from the United States was very expensive in those days. Surviving widows suddenly found themselves single parents, raising their fatherless children, in many cases with the main breadwinner no longer alive. Parents were getting older and didn't travel, and sisters and brothers were too young to come here on their own. But for my mother, although she never told me this directly, somewhere deep inside, she held out the hope that one day there would be a knock at the door and she would learn it had all been a big mistake. Coming here and seeing my father's grave would make it too real and would destroy that dream. She never came. She never remarried. She mourned him until the day she died. But in her sadness, she always had a special place in her heart for the people of the Netherlands and for those who had adopted graves. She would have been so honored to meet members of the adoption committee and Petra, Boy, and Pim Nijkens, who have adopted 5 graves here, including my father's. When she met Dutch people traveling in the United States, she made a point of speaking with them and thanking them. And when I traveled here for the first time in 1974, she devoured the letters I wrote and the pictures I took. So where does this lead? It leads to the fact that I, and the hundreds of thousands of natural-born descendants of these 10,022, want you, their adopted descendants, to know how appreciated you are and how grateful we are to each and every one of you. You have made a positive difference in the lives of those these dead have left behind. And so, namens mijn vader, on behalf of my father, Staff Sergeant Max Schoten, United States Army, serial number 321-93094. Namens zijn vrouw, on behalf of his wife, my mother, Sylvia Schoten, who, if any part of life is fair, is with my father today looking down on all of us. Namens zijn dochter in wet, on behalf of his daughter-in-law, my wife Betsy, who has joined me in mourning and missing my father since the day of our marriage. Namens zijn oudste kleinzoon, on behalf of his eldest grandson Matthew, who is named for my father. Namens Matthew's vrouw, on behalf of Matthew's wife Sharon, who this fall will give birth to his great-grandchild. Namens zijn jongste kleinzoon, on behalf of his youngest grandson David, who, when he visited here for the first time, left a letter he had written to his grandfather, telling him how thankful he was for his sacrifice and the sacrifice of the others buried here so that David and his generation could be free. Namens de leden de AWON, on behalf of the members of AWON, many of whom, the Margraten kids, have parents buried here. On all of their behalf, I stand here today. Door het maken van deze dood deel van uw familie. By making these dead part of your family, you have become part of our family. You have created a bond between us that will never be broken. So from this day forward, from now until the end of time, hartelijk bedankt, a heartfelt thank you. May the kindness and compassion you have shown them and us be returned to you many times over. We thank you, we salute you, we are forever grateful. Bedankt.
Als men komt in de buurt van Margraten, daar ligt het grote Amerikaanse kerkhof. Daar liggen duizenden soldaten. Ze gingen er met eeuwig verlof. Het waren gewone mensen zoals wij, en toch grote helden door wat zij voor ons hebben gedaan. Nu liggen zij ver van huis, in onze velden. Denken wij daar nu nog eens aan?
Near Margraten, if you are ever there, you will find a large American cemetery. Thousands of soldiers lie there on eternal leave. They were ordinary people, just like us. But we call them great heroes when we think of all they did for us. Now they rest, far from home, in our fields. Do we remember them?